Okay, right. So what I'll do is I'll just give you a cue, like hit me, Joanne, or something like that. Okay.
Sounds great.
All right, that sounds good. That sounds good. We're not going to be terribly formal here since we're probably mostly all at home or remote. So that's probably the best way to be. Um, yeah, well, yeah. Thanks, Ryan and Joanne and everybody
Yeah.
for inviting me. Yeah, it's great to great to kind of do this. It's I'm being an economist and being one of these guys that a lot of people don't like to hear the economic point of view because rightly so, economists have a reputation for doom and gloom and all sorts of nastiness and making all sorts of prognostications that aren't necessarily pretty. So basically what I'm going to do is kind of change that up a bit because I think that there's a lot to think about. And being an economist, where I basically, yeah, hit me, Joanne.
Oh,
We're looking at I mean, just think about it this way. I mean, we don't have perfect knowledge. Nobody does, right? So this idea, I'm kind of stealing this from Morgan Housel. And if you don't know Morgan Housel, he's a financial journalist. He's quite good in terms of taking that 30,000 foot view of markets and that sort of thing. And so I'm kind of plagiarizing him a bit just to kind of start things off because I think he makes some very good points that, somebody would have told you in January what April was going to look like, you wouldn't have believed him, right? And if somebody in April told you that the protests and everything else would have knocked COVID-19 off the news, you wouldn't have believed that either, right? So the question is, how do you analyze the world when everything is kind of feeling broken and changing fast and all the rest of this kind of stuff? And I think part of it is, I mean, this kind of may sound religious in some ways or whatever, but the idea that hit me, Joanne, that you've got permanent assumptions, that you look at the world in a sort of humble point of view, but that there are things that change, but knowing that things change and knowing that things are going to change around you and that's a constant thing doesn't mean you have to be completely clueless or just give up and throw up your hands. So to sit there and you have to kind of think, okay, it's not inconsistent to say, I don't know what's going on, but there are some things I do know and I'm going to go for those, right? And this is the sort of concept of permanent assumptions, right? There are permanent assumptions that you can make about not just the world, but what you can make about real estate markets, what you can make about housing markets, and what you can make about basically any part of life. So this is sort of real estate economics thing. So we're going to go down that. The thing is what your permanent assumptions are, that's what tends to matter most over time. Okay, that's what tends to matter most over time, so that things can change and things can change quite quickly, but it's knowing these assumptions that are important. So I'm going to throw up a sort of quote here. It's from Jeff Bezos. Hit me, Joanne. It's one of these things that is that I'll just let you read it because if you can read it, I'll read it out here for you. But he gets the question, what's going on what's going to change in the next 10 years? Well, that's a very interesting question. It's a very common one. And I almost never get the question, what's not going to change in the next 10 years? And I submit to you that the second question is actually the more important of the two, because you can build a business strategy around the things that are stable in time. It's impossible to imagine a future 10 years from now where a customer comes up and says, Jeff, I love Amazon. I just wish the prices were a little higher. Or I love Amazon. I just wish you'd deliver a little bit more slowly, right? That's kind of impossible. And also, so the effort that we put into those things, spinning those things up, we know the energy we put into them today will be paying off dividends for our customers in 10 years' time. When you have something that you know is true, even over the long term, you can afford to put a lot of energy into it, right? Now, there's a lot of truth in there in terms of how real estate markets work and everything like that. So I figured it'd be a nice idea to kind of say, okay, what are the permanent assumptions for real estate markets? What permanent assumptions can we make about what's happening now and what's been going on and how it's all going to work? So it's this idea that, the more things change, the more things stay the same. So the more things change, you fall back on the permanent assumptions. And I think one of the permanent assumptions you can make I used to do this with my real estate classes all the time. First year real estate students. And I'd sit there and hold up Ben Franklin there, $100 bill, and say, okay, I want someone to name any business that doesn't require real estate or real property in order to operate in terms of human activity. Anybody that can do that gets Ben Franklin straight out of my pocket, right? And the thing is, you can't really have a business that doesn't involve real estate or real property for human activity. It's just, it's necessary, right? Even IT businesses, you got to put the server somewhere. You got to put the physical infrastructure somewhere. That requires real estate and real property rights. Another assumption that I think is fairly permanent is that households and businesses seek security and certainty. They'd rather have more certainty over their physical arrangements than less certainty, okay? Now that could be physical certainty. It could be health security, knowing that you're in a place that's healthy and safe from, health threats. It could be financial security in terms of you're building up equity in a home and that sort of thing. You're helping your financial well-being as well as having real property. And you also know your costs. That's a form of financial security. And also you've got security of tenure, because if you're renting a house from someone and they decide, well, I don't want to rent the house anymore, I'm going to sell it. Well, then you may not be able to stay there, right? Because of the changing landlords and everything else. So the security of tenure matters, right? And people would rather, I think, have more security over their tenure than less security over their tenure. They want to stay put if they want to, okay? Then the biggest kind of assumption that involves trade-offs, which is what we really like to look at as economists, is the idea that households and businesses continually strive to improve their business and living environments. And those trade-offs are what we look at in terms of real estate prices, supply, demand, and other things. Hit me, Joanne. So when we're looking at this, there's a lot of other permanent assumptions you might be able to make, but I'm going to kind of go with these because they form the basis of the economic concepts of supply and demand and how real estate markets work and how real estate markets have worked for time immemorial, right? It doesn't matter about COVID or anything like that. It's those preferences and those behavioral preferences that people have that mean something. And that means something to how people are willing to engage in a purchasing process, what supply and demand are, whether people are going to invest in real estate, and how much they're willing to pay, and the ability of paying in relation to economics, finance, and other issues. So what we're going to kind of do is test these permanent assumptions, okay? We're going to test them out a little bit and see how this fits in with the age of COVID, because the market dynamics may have changed, but they're still very similar. So I always come to this concept of the housing ladder. A lot of you that have heard me speak before maybe know that I use this quite a bit. But it's the idea that rental tenure is the most vulnerable. You have different gradations within the tenure process. So for example, in the bottom, you've got older apartments that are far away from the city, fairly cheap, fairly high density sort of living. And then you have higher quality at the next stage of the ladder, higher quality multifamily, medium quality multifamily moving toward closer to the city. And then as you move up, you get higher quality. You get higher quality, obviously, possibly higher prices. But that also depends upon how far out and how far in you are from the city. And the distance from work and schools and other amenities that people want, right? So the important thing here is you've got the concept of filtering, right? And so the idea is that if you build higher end houses, then somebody's going to in turn buy that house. So I'm going to buy a high end house. So the house I used to live in, someone's going to buy that. And then some renter is going to buy that other guy's first time buyer house. And so everybody just kind of moves up the ladder and moves down the ladder, right? So you have this continuum of tenure and the ability of people to go up and down the housing ladder and to take care of whatever housing needs they have smoothly and efficiently, right? So you have a continuum of tenure. You can also go back down the housing ladder as you get older or your needs change or whatever your lifestyle is, okay? Now, in terms of the economics of this, we need to look at this sort of simplified urban sort of model. So the idea is that prices toward the middle, and I've kind of done this before, so I'll be quick. So the prices toward closer to the city, where you have lots of amenities and that sort of thing, tend to be, higher priced. As you move further out, right? Next slide. As you move further out, the prices tend to get lower, and you tend to get lower density. You get lower density housing, possibly at the same price that you would have closer into the city, right? And then the idea that as everything moves, right? Next one, please. If we can, that is, the whole city moves and people go out further, right? As people go out further from the city, then the whole market moves up and prices go up generally, okay? So this occurs within rental and ownership markets as people move up and down the housing ladder and as their preferences change over time and, for whatever reason, okay? So it's the ability of that to happen that matters in housing markets. Now, those are sort of the basic economics there. Those basic economics work no matter what, right? That's how people tend to operate, right? That's how property markets have operated for years and years and years, right down to Roman and ancient times, okay? Now, if we go to the next slide, I'm just going to kind of go over some prices here just to kind of start us off with some of the numbers and everything, because I don't think that, while the numbers are important, they tell a story, but a story is more important than the numbers, right? But so let's get some numbers going here. As you can see, Clark County is doing fairly well, 2.7% so far this year, about 6% year on year. Washington median is somewhere around 431,000. If you look, Spokane is kind of lower than everybody else there, and they're just kind of hanging along there. But I mean, notice that the prices have been moving up, and they're still moving up. Now, this is from the first half of the year. Obviously, there's a lot of changes that have happened since March. But if you notice, the prices haven't gone flat. They haven't done what people might expect, right? Is that people aren't going to engage. I mean, everybody kind of knows from what they're doing out there that prices are moving up, right? So let's look at supply and demand, okay? Let's move down to the demand equation here. Next slide, please. And we'll just kind of see what this looks like, okay? On the demand side, of course, people need to have jobs, right? If I can go to the next one, please. People need to have jobs. And we all know from looking at the news and everything else that, employment has been crazy. Everybody was forced off work. Everybody's been working from home. We're here at Zoom meetings now rather than going into the office and having everything else that happens with going into the office and lots of people around, right? So non-farm employment, the peak was in February, right, at 3.52 million. It dropped down to 2.97 million, right? So more than 500,000 people in Washington were out of work as a result in 1 month, right? To kind of put this in context, the peak of the global financial crisis, it was about 2.8 million was the workforce. So we came about 100,000 people, within 100,000 people of having more or less employment than we did in 2010, in February 2010. So the large jump for May, I mean, is, the May figures and everything else, you can kind of see it at the end there, that sort of tick up, right? And that's what a lot of people are holding their hopes on. The people are going to go back to work, the jobs are going to be there, and then everything's going to, work out and be even better. And it's just going to be one of these V-shaped recoveries in employment. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. And if you look at it just in another context here, the unemployment rate obviously went way up for everybody. Now, the unemployment rate in Washington was, this is for May, or for April, ended up being 16.3%. It kind of topped out in Clark County at 13.8%. This is not seasonally adjusted or anything. So, but this would indicate that, all right, people need jobs. People want to pay mortgages. They want to buy houses. It's always good to have a job. You increase employment, you have an increasing labor force and a growing economy that puts pressure on wages, and people start to buy houses, and people start buying houses and doing what they're doing. That's what usually drives house prices. Ironically, in this case, What's driving house prices is the same. The people who have jobs, the people who thought about or are thinking about buying later in the year are saying, we want to buy now, right? Remember this concept of security, right? Let's go back to the permanent assumptions here for a second. If I want to have security in terms of how I live, right? Am I better off possibly buying a house that I know I can afford and knowing what my payments are going to be for the next 2 or 3 years if I'm secure in my job, as opposed to being in the rental market where I'm going to be paying rent? I don't know what the rents are going to be in the next 2 or 3 years. My rents could go up, my rents could go down. I can have landlords decide they want to sell. So if I want to improve my quality of life, and if I want separation from other people, if I want social distancing, if I want physical distancing, I don't want density in terms of my housing, then I'm more likely to go out and buy in an outer suburban area, right? So that makes a lot of sense. So when you remember the whole security concept, well, this is kind of like, getting things together. Those who want homes are going to go out and try and find homes, right? Now, put the reverse on this, right? You have a lot of people who have homes and they don't want to sell, right? They don't want to sell those homes because they know what they've got. They know what they've got. They want to stay where they are. They're going to stay put, right? So ironically, this kind of change in the unemployment rate doesn't really mean a lot, because a lot of the people who were unemployed, and the unemployment, the way it hit the service industries hardest, it means most of those people were renters. And so they were in the rental market anyway, and it was unlikely they were going to buy. So it's a bit of a strange sort of thing here, but this sort of permanent idea that people want to improve their living conditions and have more security feeds into this. We better do it now because we don't know what the short-term future is going to hold. So we're going to take care of this longer-term permanent assumption here. Okay, let's go to the next one. And one thing that isn't changing, that hasn't changed, is the sort of demographics that you have within the population. So looking at the Washington population here, if you notice, the population increases quite a bit, but most of the population increases in over 65 population, right? We're expecting another 50% increase in the over 65 population in the state of Washington over the next 20 years, right? That's a lot. That's a whole lot. And a lot of those people are homeowners. They may be homeowners from somewhere else, and they're saying, hey, we're going to go buy now. We're going to go buy those homes. We're going to set up where we want to be, away from everybody a bit, maybe in a smaller town, to have the sort of lifestyle we want, because we don't need a big house in the city anymore. We don't need a big house in an inner suburb. And so we're going to take that cash, we're going to move up on that equity, and we're going to move to somewhere. Now, Clark County has always been a place where you've had overflow from the Portland area. You've always had suburban type, if you wanted a detached house in this Portland area, Camas, Battleground, all that whole area of Clark County is where people are going to go, right? It's where people are going to go in the Portland area, because that's where you have good schools and a lot of other things. So those people are likely to say, okay, we're going to go for the cheaper housing that's further out because we don't need to be in the city, right? Now, with those demographics, you've only got the first-time buyers increasing there, but that gold line, 50% increase, those people are looking too. So there's increased pressure on those guys to look for housing now, right? Look for housing now so that they can have that security. Just moving on, if we can look at the retirement age population, I mean, one, we know it's increasing rapidly, but we have a lot of things from the tax changes in 2018 that are working in favor of people moving, right? This hasn't changed. This is still here. This was happening before COVID-19, okay? Is that you had 40% of existing homeowners in California saying that they wanted to sell and they wanted to leave California, right? 40% of existing homeowners are wanting to leave, okay? A lot of it comes from the tax changes in 2018 that are still in place. So you can only deduct $10,000 in state and local taxes. Well, in California, it doesn't take a lot to hit that. If you own a home and you have any income whatsoever, you're going to hit that $10,000 cap fairly quickly. In Washington, on the other hand, where you have no income tax, right, it all comes down to property taxes. And so if you go to a place like Clark County that is, people may say it has high property taxes, but it's highly unlikely your property tax bill, if you have a moderately priced house, is going to be over $10,000 a year. Whereas in California, a moderately priced house was likely to have that, plus your income taxes. So that's pressure to move, and that's going to create demand pressure and migration. And if people are worried about the future, if they're worried about the short term and they want more security in how they're going to live, and they can work away from home, or they could work away from where their office is, why not? Why not move to Clark County? Why not move to Spokane? Why not move to Bellingham? Why not move to a lot of other communities where you can have a quality of life, this improvement, quality of life, permanent assumption here, and get what you need and work from home in a much more comfortable environment. This also leads to a lot of cap rate compression. There's a lot of stuff happening in the financial markets. This was happening pre-COVID-19 as well, but it's sped up. Nothing has changed here in that you've got a lot of cap rate compression. Where are you going to invest, right? You're not going to get much money if you stick it in the bank. There's hardly any return there. You're not going to get a whole lot of money from the stock market right now unless you're willing to sweat it out and wait 10 or 15 years. And that could be a roller coaster. Nobody really knows what's going to happen in the short term with that, right? Bond yields are at record lows. So where are you going to get a return on your investment, especially if you're getting close to retirement? You're going to invest in real estate. So what happens is you get a cap rate compression where, people are going to invest in real estate. They don't really care if the yield for a bad property is close to the yield for a really good property, right? The idea that the rental market is a one-way bet. There's no other place for investors to go. And so it's a good way for people to have their retirement income, given the demographics that have been happening for a while, to go into the market. So from the demand point of view, there's a lot of demand out there in the marketplace. The demand is still there. Nothing has changed there. If anything, I guess I'd liken it to, I don't know how many of you guys fish, right? But probably a bad analogy here. But, if you've ever been fishing and you have a lure and you see a fish following the lure, you have two choices, right? You can either slow it down. Some people slow it down with the idea, oh, the fish can catch it. Well, the fish is going to catch it if it wants to. But then the other idea is you speed it up like it's trying to get away. And a lot of times the fish will just go, oh, you're not getting away, and it'll grab it, right? I think a lot of that is the psychology of what's going on now. People see their opportunity. They see uncertainty down the road, and they want to create certainty in terms of what they're doing in the real estate market, what their housing situation is going to be, and basically how they can stay put somewhere. And that it's sped up the trends that have already happened. So the more things change, the more things stay the same, right? So if we can move on a bit, well, we'll move on to supply, right? Now the supply sort of thing, if you want to look at these existing home sales, this is from Clark County. As you can see, sales volumes are down. That's primarily because listing volumes are down. Sales activity is down. If you look at month supply, which is the next slide, our data is quarterly. We differ somewhat in terms of measurement from the RMLS data. But if you look month supply, RMLS data is saying it's down to 2.4 months supply. Last year it was over 3. If you look at the WCRER data, which is compiled a little differently, we're at about 1.6 months supply. Either way, the point is that the number of listings for sale and the availability property is down. And it's down now more than it was pre-COVID-19. Now that trend was going down anyway. Now it's kind of speeding up, right? So we're expecting in the second quarter to have a sharp downturn in month supply. There's less volume. There's continued high demand. We've talked about that. So, but there's fewer people putting their properties on the market. Now, people say, well, now is a great time to sell, possibly, right? But think about it from this security point of view, back to the permanent assumptions here, right? That's somewhere that they can call home. That's a place of safety, health, what they know they're going to have. So people who are happy with where they are going to stay. They're not going to worry about the financial arbitrage, because a lot of times if they've been there, they're already in a financially secure position, okay? So the idea that prices are going to go up, it may not be just because there's a huge demand, because there is, but you've also got supply staying steady simply because people may not want to move, that whole safety security thing. right? Moving on a bit. This is a slide that I look at. The building has gone crazy, building's still crazy. But the thing to think about, remember the housing ladder here, okay? Condos and rental units and that sort of thing, from a health point of view, think about this. It's possibly less desirable to live in higher density housing now than it was in March. That may have changed. So the supply that you're thinking about getting and the supply that's coming online may not necessarily be what people want to buy if health security is something that's right on the edge of their mind. For example, I have a friend of mine who lives in Capitol Hill, and lots of things have been happening in Capitol Hill, obviously, but she has a condo, right? And this was the place she was going to retire, the place she was going to be, and everything else. Very nice condo. Then COVID-19 hits, and I've got to go into a hallway and possibly pass people in order to get to an elevator to go down to the supermarket in a high density urban area. So with those health and safety, she was very safe in the condo. It's a secure building and everything else. But now the health security, she's going, I'm not sure I want to be in a condominium building, right? So the condominium's on the market, and where are they going? Well, they're actually going to Spokane, not Clark County, not Vancouver, but they're going to Spokane simply because of that change. I can work from Spokane. I'm working from home most of the time anyway, so I might as well. So there's the possibility that the types of units, multifamily units that might be built as condos, and there aren't any being built anyway, are less desirable, right? So higher density may not be as desirable. There were some interesting Redfin figures that came out yesterday just on that sort of supply thing. And while we're talking about prices, is that they did a national survey of prices. They found, they broke things down by percentiles in terms of the housing market in the US. And the houses priced between 6 and 35%, 6th percentile and 35th percentile, right? So that's roughly, third of the market right there. That rose 5.5% in the first 5 months of the year, right? The percentile between 66 and 99%, like the higher end of the market, so the upper third of price categories, only increased by 2%. 2% in the year. So nationally, that tells you that people are downsizing. They're either trying to downsize, they're not buying bigger houses, they're trying to downsize. First-time buyers who have the income and the means to buy a property are trying to buy property. And the people who are already in properties aren't selling, right? This comes down to a security argument, and they want to be safe where they are. They're fine staying put. And the people who want to move are trying to move, and they're finding a lot less availability, and they're having to pay. So we moved on to economics and finance. Let's kind of look at interest rates here. Interest rates are at record lows. Everybody kind of knows that one. Right now we're at 3.13% for a 30-year fixed. That's extraordinarily low. If you want to go to some arms out there, it's unbelievably low. Same with short money. The bond markets are just really pricing in no interest rate movements, no inflation, anything like that. So from an economics point of view, in terms of affordability, money has never been cheaper, right? Money has never been cheaper for buying a house. So if you want to see what effect that has, on the next slide, you can see where I took the peak of the last cycle, right? Peak interest rates for the last cycle, which is roughly November 2018, okay? And then we took the March 2020 payment, right? We took the March 2020 payment, and then we took the payment that you have now from June 2020, right? With even lower interest rates. They were fairly low in March. Now they're even lower, okay? And if you look at, there's some really interesting things here. So if you look at somebody who took out a $200,000 mortgage, they're paying $193 less a month. From the peak interest rates to current interest rates, right? It's $193 a month of the difference on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage for $200,000. But the interesting thing is they can afford to bid up prices. So if you look at the November 2018 payment, which is about $1,050, right? You move down, for $1,071, they can borrow $250,000 now. So they can borrow more to try to bid up prices. This was happening even in March, right? This was happening even in March, but now you've got an extra 45 bucks in terms of that spending, right? An extra 45 buck decline in the payment, which means you can afford to spend more to try and get that house, right? So that helps fuel prices, as low interest rates always do, okay? So that's nothing has changed there. Nothing has changed there. So I'm just going to make my nod to housing affordability because it's a huge problem. So if we move to the next slide, we've got the housing affordability index. And as you can note there that Clark County is still fairly affordable overall, right? Overall, it's fairly affordable. But if you keep moving down, first-time buyers, it's not affordable. It hasn't been affordable for a while. And while interest rates have helped, and more steady prices before have kind of helped, now you've got this rush on. So you've got older people that have equity in their homes, trying to sell, trying to downsize, trying to get to a stable, less dense environment to be in, right? They're making the moves they want to make now because they need to now, and over for health security, financial security, and every other reason. So they're wanting to make the move. Now, first-time buyers say, well, I don't want to stay in an apartment or a townhouse and possibly get sick, and I don't want to stay in this high-density environment. If I'm going to be alone and working from home, I want a better lifestyle. And so they're all competing for the same sort of lower to middle end of the market. And so that creates a lot of pressure, which means housing affordability, it's going to be a real issue. It's going to be a real issue, even with low interest rates, simply because prices just are going to keep moving. If we keep moving, let's go back to the permanent assumptions here, right? Now, we talked about affordability. We've got the housing ladder. We have all the rest of these things. And the idea is looking at it from a permanent assumptions point of view. I've talked about the missing middle before, which is the next slide. And you've got this middle rung of the ladder. Now, with the unemployment being what it is, right, that's primarily hit the service sector and the sector that is involved in rental housing. So that you've got a lot of rental housing dynamics there. But you've also got everybody who's trying to improve their lives trying to do it right now, which means you're getting a widening gap. So that middle rung of the ladder that used to be filled by higher density ownership condos that haven't been built in the last cycle at all, right? Now you've got an issue that people that are in the rental market, they're going to say, maybe I'll never be able to buy a house again. And it's putting pressure to try and buy a house now while they can, if they have their jobs, okay? So there's something in terms of this gap. So the permanent assumption that was always there, people wanting to improve, and the dynamics of having that middle rung of the ladder gone in terms of first-time buyer housing being built, now you've got everything else thrown into the mix. So those permanent assumptions would indicate that gap is going to get wider. And that gap is going to create problems further down the line for people who want to buy, right? So going into the sort of permanent assumptions, we have this sort of permanent assumption that wage growth and employment growth equals high fundamental demand, but the needs for security, the sort of behavioral dynamics, right, mean that those numbers don't mean anything, okay? In a low interest rate environment where banks are still willing to lend if you have good credit and everything else, that need for security is going to trump anything else, right? People are going to want that security. They're going to want that security of tenure. They're going to want to know what their house payments are going to be for the next 30 years, right? We've got favorable demographics. We've got a lack of supply, and people can stay put, right? Which means supply situation is not going to get any better based upon the demographics. You may have infill, gentrification, and all the rest of this stuff, but that housing ladder, that missing middle problem is going to get worse, okay? And infill and gentrification and building higher density in cities, it's not going to really happen in this market because people don't want that type of density. They're going to gentrify in areas that are lower density, okay? That's what they're going to want to do. The question is, will they be able to? So first-time buyers may want to look further out from the employment because they can get value for money, right? I'm working from home. I could be anywhere right now, okay? So those dynamics matter in terms of first-time buyers. They're going to go for value. They're going to go further out. They're going to go to places like Clark County. Even if they're working in Portland, they may go to Clark County, or they may say, you know something, Silicon Valley, I can live in a nice school area like Ridgefield, Camas, that sort of thing. Send my kids to nice schools in the future, have a nice house. I'm close enough to Portland, get the amenities I like, and it's cheaper than the Bay Area. Why not, right? So it's these dynamics. So the idea that more things have changed, the more things have stayed the same. So looking at this longer term, I mean, just think of the permanent assumptions, right? And as long as people want to secure a home to weather whatever storm there is, the psychology of buying is going to matter more than the numbers. People are going to want it, and they're going to pay a price for it because they want it. And they're afraid they're not going to be able to get it in the short future. And the renters are the ones that are likely to be affected. And so given the supply pressure and given everything else, you know, it's these peripheral mid-sized cities, and what's going on in Clark County is going to be key, right? So I think you're still going to see, you know, declines in terms of existing homes listings. Seniors have cash. The next slide, please. And hit me, Joanne. So seniors have cash. First-time buyers are going to need a mortgage. So that's going to be an issue. So, you know, once again, Vancouver, Ridgefield, Camas, places like that have traditionally been an overflow for lower density housing in the Portland area, that trend's just speeding up. And that trend, I think, is going to speed up as long as people feel stress and they feel a need to add some sort of permanence in their living situation. So with that being said, I think you guys are really, really doing it up. I hope that kind of helps frame thinking, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Young, always appreciate your insight and really how you're able to zoom in on Clark County for us. I did have a couple notes, and, you know, it's not something that you and I have always chatted about a whole lot, but one thing you mentioned that has me curious, you know, as we start, you know, talking about how to make decisions for growth and accommodating growth. And I don't know if you saw, but Vancouver actually had the second highest population growth, I believe, in the state. It was announced yesterday. I might be wrong on some of the specifics. But anyway, you talked about how there's going to be an increase in the 65 and older population moving to Clark County. So I suppose maybe one of my questions is, how should that guide the growth that we're going to start preparing for? I mean, that's something that we've known is going to be, you know, more and more of a factor in terms of our decisions, but it seems like that hasn't slowed it down. And maybe with some of the housing security issues being present and the pressure on the market, do you think that that's, you know, more of a focus on like cottage housing, or do you think it's more of like the aging in place multi-generational housing, or just more units in general?
Well, I think the sort of aging in place multi-generational housing, that would be a real back to the future sort of thing. And I think that that's something that might happen in the longer term. But I think that what preferences are now, and people are so spread out from their families and everything else. I mean, I've lived all over the world and everything else. And I mean, my mom would go crazy if she lived with me. I'd go crazy if my mom lived with me, in a sort of multi-generational sort of setup. But it, you know, needs be that have to in terms of security and financial security and everything else. I think that a lot of the plans and dynamics that have been done for housing and for housing needs and planning purposes and that sort of thing on supply have focused quite a bit on density. And I think, and I've been attending some meetings for the GMA, that they still are. They're still saying we need to build density around transit hubs. Well, if I'm concerned about a health outcome and you've got an aging population, are they going to sit there and say, well, I can always take a train into the city? Well, if I'm older, I'm in a vulnerable group for this virus. Am I going to live in higher density housing where I want to catch a train into the city? I may be rethinking what I want to do in terms of my lifestyle and having health security, right? So to that extent, what's going to happen in Clark County, you've actually got less density than Portland. You've got less density than a lot of the markets that these guys are moving from. So that's something that's not going to change. I don't think. I think
Yeah.
people had preferences for that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the people who had preferences for higher density housing are going to be moving for less density. So the current supply setup and the current plans, the current dynamics of the supply chain are not conducive to adding that type of housing. You don't see a lot of detached houses for first-time buyers being built anymore.
No.
You don't see a lot of detached houses, even for the lower middle end of the market, being built anymore, right? Except way out,
Yeah.
right? And so that may be too far for a lot of older people and that sort of thing. So
Okay.
it's you know, I think those dynamics are just, those things were already in place. Like I say, it's like a fish catching a lure. They're just going for it now,
Yeah.
you know?
So we did have another question. So what will happen to demand for investing in rentals, given the eviction moratoriums both at the federal and state level, which is really having a pinch on a lot of the owners and landlords, and they're having a hard time making up the fact that they're not receiving any income for those.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. That's a really tough one. And that's a form of financial risk that I think a lot of landlords are going to struggle with. And I think that in terms of supply, what you're going to have is maybe people saying, well, I'm either going to weather it or I'm not. If I can afford to weather that storm in terms of I have a high equity, I can afford my payments, I can afford to work with my tenant to make those payments over a longer term. And if they're a good tenant, it provides, an incentive to keep the tenant and keep working and to get some income out of the property. But if I'm over leveraged, right? If I've taken out a huge amount of debt to get into the rental market, I don't have a huge down payment and I'm cash strapped anyway. So I've done that. Then an eviction moratorium is going to be really hard if your tenant can't pay. Now, there's not a lot of evidence that tenants aren't paying. Tenants seem to be paying if they can. It's the idea that they're going to pay while they can because that money is not going to evaporate. That they're going to have to pay that rent sooner or later, or to work something out to pay that rent. So while people can pay it, most people are paying it. To where they can't, you're going to have a small subset there. I think that some investors are going to be struggling. The tenants are going to be struggling, and that house may be back on the market and out of the rental market, possibly. I think that's going to be an interesting dynamic to watch. I think it's the length at which you have an evictions moratorium that matters, and whether the employment recovery, which predominantly, that employment predominantly hits renters,
Sure.
as to whether you get that V-shaped recovery in employment or not. I think that's what really matters.
Yeah.
But some people may just decide it's too much risk to take.
Sure. Another question that I had, and you sort of briefly touched on the fact that we've had this mandatory pivot, you might say, to working from home, and now looking at going forward, what sort of long-term impacts are those going to have? It was a couple of years ago that at the state level, we sort of got involved with like a rural broadband bill.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's become a little bit more of an issue at our national level as well. And so what sort of thoughts do you have on how that could impact, the housing market if those types of priorities continue to move forward? And like you said, you have a friend that currently in Capitol Hill, but moving to Spokane, because at the end of the day, I mean, you could probably buy close to almost twice the house in Spokane that you can in Capitol Hill. And if it's all the same, how does that make an impact for somebody that's like, hey, you know what? I can sort of work from anywhere, and now government's prioritizing that as possibly public utility in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to where it's possible to work from home and where the infrastructure exists to be able to work from home, those places are going to have a huge advantage. I mean, absolute huge advantage. And that's not just broadband infrastructure, or technology infrastructure. It's a lot of other infrastructure. for example, I'm trying to remember, there's a place, kind of Skagit County, neck of the woods, close to Mount Vernon. Fabulous place. They have a lot of good technology infrastructure, that sort of thing. No natural gas, right? No natural gas. And so everybody's just like, well, okay, you know, I'd get a place out there, but I'm not going to have propane. You know, I don't want to have propane and that sort of thing. So while you may have a good lifestyle, you're close to Bellingham, you're both Seattle, that's, you know, that's not happening simply because of some other infrastructure. I think you've got to have all the pieces of the pie together, and people are going to say, okay, I can make this work, which is, I think, goes to the question as to what's important in Clark County here. Because Clark County has the infrastructure and you're close to a major market, right? You're right across the river from a major market. You don't have to worry about crossing a bridge as much anymore, right? You don't have to worry about that infrastructure bottleneck that you had before, right? So working from home and trying to buy in Clark County for someone in Portland is going to be a lot more attractive. I think that that's the biggest thing you've got going right now in Southwest Washington, is the ability of people to get out of Portland, to get out of those markets, or to even move from the Bay Area to someplace like the Portland area where they can have the amenities that they like and not have to worry about some of the infrastructure constraints that Clark County suffered from, being with the river and everything dividing them from a major market. So I think there's a lot of good there in terms of how this is coming out. I think Clark County has a lot of advantages.
Yeah. So a question that we had from the chat was, and it sort of piggybacks on that last comment. In your opinion, what is the single biggest real estate issue facing realtors in Southwest Washington?
Wow. That's a big question. Well, I mean, I think in terms of market dynamics, you've got a lot of there from the bridge, and I've talked about all that. I think the biggest thing you have is growth management, the ability to have supply, the ability to have quality infill development, say in downtown Vancouver, and places that are predicated around density, the riverfront development and everything else are predicated around getting people to the riverfront and having large groups of people down at the riverfront. Well, you know, for the next couple of years, well, for the next few months anyway, that's not going to happen. And regardless of whether you can do it or not, people are going to think about that in the back of their mind a little more than they did before. Right?
Sure.
So I think given that's the case, that the biggest issue in Southwest Washington for realtors is, where's the supply going to come from? Where's the volume going to come from? Prices moving up is one thing, and prices moving up, everybody kind of says, oh, okay, but that papers over a lot of cracks, because realtors need volume, and realtors need people exchanging houses, and prices going up is one thing, but unless you have the volume, that price better get pretty high, because if you're only selling 1 or 2 houses a year, you're in trouble. Right? So you've got to get that volume up. I think that's the biggest thing. That's the biggest thing. Not only that, you've got a lot of government issues that are coming up, government budgets that are gone, government budgets that are going to be really seriously constrained. And I think to the extent that they are going to approve infrastructure and increase in housing supply, and change how they do things in terms of that, is not likely to happen. But I think it's a huge, that's probably the biggest issue for you guys, is how to take advantage of the fact that the infrastructure constraints of people work from home aren't there anymore. Can you take advantage to build supply to get people there and to keep the volume levels and transaction levels up?
Yeah. Well, and that was sort of the next question that popped into our chat was, you know, these budget shortfalls that a lot of our municipalities are facing, you know, how do you expect that to impact the real estate industry?
Well, there's going to be a lot of pressure on property taxes. And I think, I think the next legislative session is going to be pretty ugly. It's going to be very ugly. I know, as a state employee, working for the University of Washington, we've been asked to reassess everything, and everything's being reassessed. Local governments, I think, are going to get hit a lot harder. And to the extent that they're able to raise revenue, or their revenue has gone down, it's going to be a tough issue It's going to be a
Yeah.
tough issue in terms of getting the infrastructure together. But I think it's the impact of increased taxes on housing costs if you're an existing owner isn't as much as it's going to be on renters, because that gets passed on through rent.
Sure.
So if I'm a multifamily operator and people say, oh, well, commercial property, let's pass it on to big business. Well, if you've got an 8-plex somewhere or 12-plex, you're far from a big business, but you've got to pass on those costs to your tenants in terms of increased rent.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge issue in terms of how they decide to raise the revenue is a big thing.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. I had another one pop here in the chat. I heard that 40,000 state employees will hit the unemployment system 1st of July. How does that change the percentages?
It probably will quite a bit. Well, think about it. When you've got a labor force of roughly right now 3 million,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're changing the dial by 1.5%.
1.5%. Yeah.
You're changing the dial by 1.5%. The thing is, if you have service employees and other people coming back, is that going to offset what you're going to get from state employees? And I think the verdict is out on that. I think given that the service sector was completely shut down in April, I think that'll be more than offset by the increase in service employment. I think the question is, to what extent would people have to lock down again, given the spread of the virus? I think I don't think there's a huge appetite to lock things down like they were before.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, how's it all going to work?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I do have one more. So, this goes back into budgets and property taxes because this is how it's generally funded. But do you think schools will continue to be one of the primary reasons people from out of state select a certain city or a certain neighborhood? And how do you think that dynamic will impact pricing? And so it's really, what sort of impacts on school districts do you think might actually impact the neighborhoods or the areas that those districts serve?
Okay. I'm going to kind of break that into 3 parts.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'm going to break it into 3 parts here, right? Everybody kind of knows that, school districts matter, that
Mhm.
you're going to get higher prices with better schools, that sort of thing. That price increases, if prices are going to increase, capital value growth is going to happen first in areas that have good schools, right?
Yeah.
So breaking that down, we know that property market dynamic. The second thing is, okay, how are you going to continue to have a geography-based educational enrollment system when things are going online? That's what we're finding out, is that if you have online classes, students can be anywhere.
Yeah.
Right? I gave a thing like this the other day, and a guy was asking me the other day questions, Q&A like you were. He was on a boat.
Oh.
Right?
I'm not.
So,
I wish I was, but
yeah, so from an education point of view,
yeah.
right? There's nothing to say that the students can't be wherever they want to be as long as they have a good connection.
Yeah.
One of the attendees at this thing was actually in New Zealand. In the middle of the night, they were stuck down in New Zealand. Well, there's no disease in New Zealand. I'm staying here, and they're working from home in New Zealand, right? To the extent, and they're teaching classes from New Zealand, right? So the teacher is in New Zealand, right?
Yeah. Wow.
So to the extent that you have a geographic-based model, I think the future is out on that. So that's long-term down the road. So a lot of that's going to depend upon what happens next year, how schools are going to be configured and everything else. Then you get to the tax base. So what's going to happen in terms of taxation and schools being funded through geographically based property taxes? If it doesn't matter where you are and where you live, well, okay, I could be in Texas and I want to send my kid to school in Camas. Okay, go for it. But they're not contributing to the tax base or paying for that education system. So I think there's a lot of questions there in terms of education, public education, that haven't been asked. Everything moves so quickly to online that nobody knows what's really going to happen. And I know from the university point of view, the university is struggling with how do you make people a husky or a cougar if, if they don't, how do you make them a husky or a cougar if they haven't attended football games, if they can't go to sporting events, if they don't have the social interaction that affiliates them with that university, right?
Yeah.
And they're just on video. How do you create that identity? And I think that that's what the higher education system is struggling with as well. So it's a crazy one. It's crazy.
Yeah, the sense of the sense of community, that's such a big part of the education system, K-12, university. That's such a big part. I do have one more question, and I guess I'll put it out there as being sort of last call, just since we're running up on the 12 o'clock hour. Will my mom, I hope my mom doesn't watch this recording, but will the Huskies win the Pac-12 title?
Oh boy. You know something?
I say that because my mom's a Coug.
Yes. Well, I think the Cougs are a long shot. Let's put it that way. I think the Cougs are a bit of a long shot. I don't know about the Huskies this year. I really don't. I think the verdict is out on our new coach and everything. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say, yes, I hope so. And I grew up in the South, so I'm praying to God we have a football season. So, yeah, so that's kind of my thing. But and I hope the Cougs do well. And I have to say my affiliation is still with the Arkansas Razorbacks school. So I'm going to stay out of the Cougs Dogs thing.
That's probably smart in this neck of the woods. So, well, I don't see any other comment. I do have a comment that does say "Go Cougs" in the chat though. So
there you go.
We'll put that out for the public record. Excuse me. But, we're coming up here on the noon hour. I think we've really hit a lot of great parts of not just what's going on in the state of Washington, but in Clark County. And so certainly I thank you for taking the time to really dive in and show really what impacts we've had and what direction we could be heading in. I think that's always valuable information.
No worries. It's always good. It's always good talking to you, Ryan.
Well, and hopefully next time, we do one of these, it might be, a socially distanced, actual in-person event. Who knows?
Hey, that would be good.
So,
that would be good.
All righty, sir. Well, with that, we're right here almost at 12 o'clock. So I appreciate everybody taking the time today. Dr. Young, certainly I appreciate you taking the time. Washington Center for Real Estate Research, it's one of the best resources our industry has in this state. And that's really the result of the good work that Dr. Young and his colleagues are doing. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Great. Hey, thank you, Ryan.
All righty. Well, folks, enjoy the rest of the week.
Yep. Hey, have a good 4th of July.
Thank you.